Good morning, everyone, and welcome to NUPI, and welcome to today's breakfast book lunch, featuring our good colleague Bjørnar Sverdrup-Thygeson and his book, The Identity Factor in Chinese Relations with Europe, China, and the Barbarian Civilization. My name is Renjani Lindgren, and I am a senior researcher here at NUPI, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's seminar. First, I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping items. This seminar is being live streamed on NUPI's YouTube channel, which also means that you can access it after the seminar if you'd like to check back or recommend it to colleagues later on. This seminar is also co-hosted by FIRST, a Norwegian Research Council-funded project called, which we refer to as ANGER, but the full name is Chinese Anger, and it's about anger diplomacy. And it's not just about anger diplomacy, it's about how emotions have effects in diplomacy. And we have some of the participants, including Bjørnar and Astrid Nordin, and myself in the project, which is led by my colleague Morten Andersen, who unfortunately could not be here today. It is also hosted by the Norwegian Center for Geopolitics, which is a consortia of 5 different institutes that is led by NUPI. And we now have a presence on LinkedIn, so I'm told to encourage you to please seek us out. There you can learn more about our upcoming events and publications. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which will provide an overview of what we have been doing in the news, in our writing, and in our public activities. We will have an annual lecture as part of the Center for Geopolitics on the 15th of October, which many of us are looking forward to. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce Bjørnar and to get to experience this seminar, because we shared offices together when we were both PhD students, and Bjørnar was working very hard on this book. And one of the things I respected the most about Bjørnar's dedication and diligence to his work was his compassion for the longue durée story, the fact that history really matters in understanding contemporary politics. And I think in the case of China-Europe relations, this is especially important and something that we don't always have such insight into. So I can highly recommend this title, and I would like to begin just by giving you an overview of how the seminar will proceed. Bjørnar will begin by giving an overview of his book and presenting some of its main arguments and how it is structured, as well as the implications for what is going on today in China-Europe relations. And then we will turn to our colleague Astrid Nordin, who is the Lau Chair of Chinese International Relations at King's College, for her comments before we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So with that, I would like to introduce Bjørnar, who is well known in these corridors, but not maybe to everyone online. So Bjørnar Sverdrup-Thygeson is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, where his research focuses on Chinese foreign policy, geoeconomics, and Europe-China relations. He holds a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics and degrees in international politics and Chinese studies from the University of Oxford, University of Oslo, and a range of universities in China. He has also been the recipient of a number of awards and has published on a broad range of topics, including the topic today, China-Europe relations. So with that, I would like to pass the floor to Bjørnar. Welcome.
Thank you, Ren, and thank you to Astrid, who came all this way, agreed to give some comments on my book, which I'm very happy for.
You thank me after or not?
Yeah, yeah, that's very true, actually. I'll hold back on that for you. And of course, thanks to all of you who came, battled through the wind and rain to get here when you actually had the option of watching this very comfortably in your office on YouTube. I have a lot of other people, of course, to thank in the long process of writing this book, but that will be in the acknowledgement sections of the book itself, which is now available in all very well-stocked bookstores online, and also thanks to the Anger project, you have selected chapters open access online. So just get the QR code and start reading, essentially. Okay, so going ahead, presentation of the book in its constituent parts, some interesting conclusions to draw from it in terms of general EU-China relations, and also stepping away from the book in order to have a bit more of a forward-leaning view on current Europe-China relations and which trends are likely to shape those relations going ahead. I've been told no mic is necessary. Everyone can hear me?
But a little bit higher, please.
A little bit higher, okay. Get some water and speak up. So, why did I set out writing this book to begin with? Two main reasons for why this book became why it became. Reason number one, there really were not many books at all whatsoever on the topic of Europe-China relations. I remember a colleague coming over to my office at some point, quite some years ago now, asking me about a good book on China-Europe relations, and I gave him one, Henrik, and he was like, yeah, this is the book on China-Europe relations, and he was like, oh yeah, so this is the book. No, it's the book. It really was only one book at that point. Couple more have come out lately. Most of the books are at this point 10-ish years old. So it is a massive gap compared to my bookshelf, which is groaning under the weight of books on China-US relations. There's a new one coming out every day now, China-Japan relations, etc., etc. Which I find problematic, given that we're talking, after all, about the relationship between two of, I mean, there's a lot of talk of trade these days. These are two of the biggest trade powers in the world. So threw up an overview of the size of the global trading blocks. Europe, the EEA, which is represented there, is of course massive. And that is even compared to, because it's not only China we have there, that's actually the regional trading bloc that also includes Japan and a lot of other economies in the region. So it matters. Another key motivating factor is that the matter of identity was something that had not been covered at all to any extent in China-Europe relations, which is again covered very thoroughly amongst a number of bilateral relationships. Again, US-China, China-Japan, lots written on it, and so forth and so forth. China-Korea, not the least. And I also found that problematic, even that there are just so many weird things, as it were, happening in Europe-China relations that didn't really fit into the framework that was overwhelmingly used to analyze the relationship, which is essentially rational economic logic. Yeah, there are some examples to pick up, like the Chinese Prime Minister insisting on meeting, having a tea party with the Queen, contrary to protocol, in order to actually get diplomacy and relations between the UK and China back on track. Massive deal. If I do not get to sit down with the Queen, the entire reconciliation will just throw it out the window. And in general, it's... I saw an American academic saying how, I think he described it as nuts. Like, China had a really good thing going, right? It was building strong relationship with its neighbors, strong relationships with Europe. In the United States, there was increasingly a bipartisan, hawkish view on China and China's rise. But Europe did not, in the beginning, buy into this. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming to get Huawei out of the telecommunications, for example, massive pressure. So there was really a lot of scope for China to not push Europe into the sort of US-led China skeptic camp. But what does China do? It goes around and it makes, right in the midst of economic crisis, enemies of Lithuania, challenges the EU single market. It even makes an enemy of Sweden, which is, I mean, quite impressive. And in doing so, really pushing the EU closer to the US into a common Western bloc dealing with China, which, according to strategic logic, does not quite make sense. So there is a missing puzzle piece, I felt, in the relationship, which is the matter of identity issues, which is why I felt this book needed to be written. So, the book itself is subdivided into two sections. There is a historical section and a contemporary section. The reason for this is simply, as Vren alluded to, I think, many think, history matters. History informs current day policy choices. And history matters a lot in Chinese politics. They've been learning from history longer than any of us. I mean, that's what the emperors would do for the last couple of thousand years. And when you listen to Chinese leaders, they reference back to history all the time. And therefore, tracing these long lines of the Chinese view of Europe, I find important. And there is every reason to believe, I thought at the outset of writing this book, that identity should matter at least as much for China's relations with Europe as with other powers. Because European powers, it was the Europeans that caused this fundamental identity crisis for the Chinese political system way back in the 1850s, when the established imperial Chinese system, regarding themselves as the center of civilization for a good 2,000 years or so, was violently and suddenly overturned. Of course, China has been attacked, even conquered, at numerous points throughout history. The Mongols come to mind, the Manchu, but none of those challenged the very fundament of the Chinese political universe. It was always Beijing being the center of the civilizations with barbarians around it. When the Europeans came in, suddenly the entire thing was turned on its head. We have the quite famous, and rightfully so, when relations started, the Macartney expedition, the English going to the Celestial Court to start trade relations, and the emperor essentially packing them off, saying, "We don't really need anything from you foreign barbarians, so sit down and behave," as common practice for China for a long time. Suddenly, a few years later, the Europeans return. You have the Opium Wars. You also have a lot of internal issues in China, and the imperial system collapses. And suddenly, the former barbarians are now putting China in the position of essentially barbarian powers, whereas the Europeans are the ones that uphold the standards of civilization that the Chinese need to aspire to. And then you have, following the Opium Wars, the 100 years of humiliation, which is, again, history matters in China. It is a massive political hang-up on this 100 years of humiliation by Western European powers. even today, museum exhibitions you have in schools, universities, it is still a very live issue, which, I mean, I guess a comparison. At roughly the same time, you had the Danish-German War, which was, in many ways, at least as important. Denmark lost a lot of territory, but you don't hear the Danish going on about it in any form or fashion. Whereas, again, in China, this is still a very live issue. And so during these 100 years of humiliation after the fall of the empire, China sought to redefine themselves as a polity. In kind of technical terms, you talk about ontological security crisis, and various political entrepreneurs sought to address this by restructuring the Chinese state and figuring out their relations with Europe. So it's interesting to think about now, and of course the CCP is as established as it is, but China really was through more or less, I'll speak up, every imaginable political system through some point. They tried, well, the old imperial one fell, they tried constitutional monarchy, they tried republic, they tried authoritarian republics, and eventually, of course, communism. So, in this historical section, in addressing this, been digging into historical sources, looking at how, for the various key political entrepreneurs trying to reshape and restructure China, how they related to Europe over these 150 years since the Opium Wars. Also a background chapter as to what relations were before then, Jesuit missionaries and so on. So to summarize this section extremely shortly, the views of Europe developed from being seen as purely barbarian. Then, of course, after getting hammered in a war or two, being regarded as barbarians with some useful practical tricks that China should learn without giving up on its foreign political identity. Then, at some point, Europe turned more into a civilizational or political ideal. Particularly, Sun Yat-sen and forwards trying to establish the Republic of China. Europe suddenly took the role as the civilization to strive for, realizing that, as it was said, China cannot develop without Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science, and we need to learn that from Europe. Translating everything they could get their hands on, and taking some notes from the Japanese experience. Particularly Germany was very important in the period. There were a lot of Prussians running around in China at some point, building the new model army. But, of course, this process of making a so-called Sinified democracy was brutally ended when Mao Zedong, who instead came up with, of course, a very European ideology, that is communism, sinifying that, and then regarding Europe rather as a capitalist other during the Cold War, but less so than the United States. Europe was still regarded as a continent in play between the great powers, where China at times very actively sought to price it apart from the United States. So far, so shortly summarized, that is what has led it to the contemporary era. Question, looking at specifically in the contemporary section, is essentially, does this matter? Does this have any bearing on today's relations? And in order to price that out, the contemporary section investigates 3 cases where you have important turning points in modern China-EU relations, looking into, again, the diplomatic texts, political analysis of these, and see if you can still find identity issues shaping events beyond what you would expect from a more rational-based analysis. And in sum, again, I found that you cannot fully account for Chinese-Europe relations without bringing these identity issues into the mixture. At numerous points, key points in the development of the relationship, China feeling disrespected or particularly recognized or not recognized has made a big deal in how relations have developed. I mean, again, you can bring Li Keqiang, the prime minister, massive hang-up on meeting the Queen as one of these instances of the drive for recognition shaping what happens in relationship between, 2 of the countries sitting on the permanent members of the UN Security Council. A kind of a secular development throughout the contemporary era. I'll get a bit more onto those later. Is also, when you look at the sources, the devaluation of Europe in the Chinese view. There was a big hope back, that's like 20 years ago, early 2000s, of China really leaning into Europe as a partner in building a new multipolar world. This was, of course, the era when you had books like the coming China, Russia, emerging axis, was Shambo's book. You also had books about how 21st century was Europe's century, so it was a bit of a different age. And then Chinese went through this disillusionment after also the weapons embargo negotiations and following the financial crisis, where it was seen as increasingly a bit of a weaker supplicant to the United States. One of the outcomes of this is that you saw China policing its issues of political identity increasingly harsh as the time went on. You have, to use Norway as an example, the punity reactions after the Nobel Peace Prize to the Dalai Lama was barely existent, but of course very small potatoes compared to the reactions after the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, some 20 odd years later, which again was really small potatoes compared to what they hammered Lithuania with a couple of years ago, which I will come into a bit later. Some general takeaways from the analysis that are continuing to structure Europe-China relations. China does this particular type of identity diplomacy, massive importance of symbolism, external status recognition matters immensely. The phrase that someone or something has hurt the feelings of the Chinese people is bandied around all the time. they also have this old imperial heritage of preferring bilateral and negotiated relations with one country at a time instead of creating common rules-based structures. And they also really seek recognition for having made their political and economic system function, like functionality, legitimacy, which again comes down to feeling completely behind Europe when the empire fell after the Opium Wars, and now being able to be a leading power in production and economic prowess still matters extremely. So you have the famous China-Norway statement putting an end to the Norwegian years in the freezer, where the Norwegian government declares that it fully respects China's development path and their system, and recommends highly the developments that has taken place. It is an very odd document in the Norwegian traditions. People with more knowledge of diplomacy than me points out that this is the first time Norway has expressed respect for an authoritarian system, at least since the Kråkerøy speech, Gerhardsen, way back in the old days. And it's not something you commonly do in diplomacy, at least not in Norwegian diplomacy. So it is odd in the Norwegian Western context, but very typical for how Beijing prefers its diplomacy to be. Essentially, this statement reflects all of the points above. Seeking recognition, recognition for the political and economic system, and I mean, Norway highly commends their development. Why do they care about what Norway thinks about whether they have been good at economy? I have not seen any other country dealing with Norway in these terms, but it is typical of Chinese diplomacy with a whole lot of countries. Another takeaway that you can see is the rise of civilizationism rather than communism as a guiding identity for China. Xi Jinping leans into this very much, but it started before him. China as not communist China, but as the heir of this long imperial tradition that fell after the European influx in the 1850s. So you see, so this is one of the, so in the book I combine qualitative analysis with quantitative analysis, where I take, essentially you could get hold of every piece of Chinese diplomatic communications with Europe and European countries over the last 20-odd years. That's like a 30,000 document something in total. And to illustrate and triangulate my conclusions, I ran a quantitative analysis of this, and just looking at these key Chinese phrases, which is very important in Chinese politics. You see how they increasingly talk about Confucius and civilization is increasingly a key term in their everyday diplomatic relations with European countries, which is, and particularly the Confucius bit, for somebody who knows or thinking a bit back in Chinese history, it's essentially mind-blowing. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party was based on crushing the Four Olds. I mean, there aren't that many Confucius temples left in China because during the cultural revolutions they were torched. and going from torching Confucius shrines to increasingly bring him back into this kind of synthesis of Confucianism and Chinese traditional thought is it's quite a turnaround, but also very exemplifies very well this turn towards thinking of themselves as a separate civilization rather than a communist country. Following on to this, been a lot of talk about China's new assertiveness. A lot of that is blamed, as it were, on Xi Jinping, as mentioned in the book and illustrated also in the graph here, and the former graph for that matter. The ideological roots for this assertiveness started before Xi Jinping. There is a lot of continuities between Hu Jintao, the former president, and Xi Jinping that is often recognized. But of course, Xi Jinping has really doubled down on this and then taking it to essentially an entirely new level. It is useful to look at some of the key terms being bandied around, like of the two centenaries. It was not Xi Jinping who came up with it, it was Jiang Zemin way back in the days. But it kind of was hanging around in a drawer somewhere until Xi Jinping dusted it off and made it a central part of his political program, where by the 100 years jubilee of the Communist Party coming into being, 2021, then China would reach what was Deng's political goal, Deng Xiaoping, which is a moderately prosperous society, Xiaokang, which is, you know, it sounds reasonable and not massively ambitious. By 2049, however, which is what Xi Jinping now is gunning for, it is talk about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nations, the kind of identity reset, linking back to the idea of the Chinese civilizational state now being rejuvenated and back to its former glory. It's kind of a neat historical arc here as well. You start roughly 1850, you get 100 years of humiliation, then you get the People's Republic being established after the Second World War. 100 more years from that, 2049, circle is complete, is the idea. And of course, this assertiveness, you can also see, particularly when it comes to economic coercion, which so far has been the main Chinese manner of exerting power. Note that there are some extra years to the right on this graph, but it really illustrates how, I mean, the intentions have changed, and of course China's capabilities to exert pressure has massively changed, and the combination of this you see in the increasing use and increasing formalizations of economic pressure. And looking at that pre and post Xi Jinping, totally different picture. Oh, am I? So, so far the book, just to spice things up, and because it is a really interesting topic, I thought I would end with looking a bit at the future of Europe-China relations and what may shape it in the years going ahead. As demonstrated in the book, Chinese motivations are rooted in some very specific identity-driven issues. Where does the Chinese side? What do they think of the situation at the moment? Beijing is currently very self-confident, the aftermath of COVID, the reactions to that, really felt it vindicated their system. Looking at Western populism and strife also did not, or it did help China's view. I mean, the very. I mean, it's a kind of a hairy pronouncement, but this was in 2020, so it's still in the midst of COVID and all of that jazz. And to the Central Committee, he was declaring that the East is rising and the West is declining. Again, kind of coming back full circle. Now China is back at the top. Another key phrase that he loves to use is that we are now seeing great changes in the world that has not happened in 100 years. Xi Jinping sees the world as going through epoch-defining changes at the moment, and China being in the driver's seat. However, Xi Jinping is not an economist, and there are a lot of domestic challenges they face in the economy, demography, housing market, etc., which I can go more into later, because it is talking of epoch-defining changes. So in order for China to really become this dominating great power, what they need to do is to become the first ever authoritarian system to make the leap into a high-income nations. So the middle income trap research is quite thorough, and it has. Singapore is a bit of an outlier, but essentially South Korea, Taiwan, Poland, a number of other countries. It has not, in order to make it into an economic powerhouse with a large domestic economy, so far, by definition, you have to be some kind of democracy with that level of freedom for entrepreneurs and clear legal frameworks. If China manages, Soviet Union did not manage, no one else has managed. If China does manage, then that is something very new in recent human history, essentially. Regarding Europe, they essentially see that Europe needs China now more than the other way around. They were doing a lot. I mean, Europe was begging for money after the 2008 financial crisis and Euro crisis. That really made a big change in Chinese view of Europe. And of course, now China has a lot more capabilities to draw on due to how they've structured their development. They are able to pressure not only by using their markets, as was usually done. You make us angry, we cut off your access to the Chinese market in some way, shape or form. Now they're also able to exert pressure with Chinese exports. Typically the rare earths, what happened when Trump really tried to put a squeeze on the Chinese, well then they squeezed rare earths exports to the car industries and all the key industries, and it seemed to have worked. Trump stepped down, Europeans calmed down. And this is, which means that in an economic coercion situation, there is less shelter for Western companies. Typical example, again, would be Norway, where those years of being in the doghouse after the peace prize to Liu Xiaobo saw a lot of economic pressure, but overall the effect on the Norwegian economy was very, very minute. If you look away from the salmon sector, people sell their fish to other countries in the world anyway. But because China still needed to import key inputs to their industrial capacity building, machines, machine parts, and so on. But as China has changed, that has also changed. So back in 2010, Norway exported way more machinery to China than it exported salmon. The numbers I saw now from 2023, Norway exports to China way more salmon than it does machinery, which means that you do not have that type of shelter in an economic storm anymore. Looking at the Europe side, weather is also changed a lot, which this video should. Aha. This is what Europe-China relations looked like in the long ago of 2015. This is Xi Jinping's visit to London, in addition to all the other stuff that he did, hanging out with David Cameron in what was then branded by the UK as the golden age of golden era, that's one of the two, of China-UK relations. China was actively courted, brought in investments, technology, all of the above, not really caring too much about grumblings from the US that was going on. That has rapidly changed, and it is important to keep in mind because it happened roughly at the same time as, of course, we had the big Zeitenwende when it came to Russia for all the well-known reasons. At the same time, there was also what we call a second Zeitenwende, a rapid political change in a very short time towards China. And going much closer to the American position, and that is amongst both the public, as you can see here, a massive change following COVID, crackdown in Hong Kong, Xinjiang camps, and of course, following the Xinjiang camps becoming a big deal, so to speak, China putting some sanctions on members of the European Parliament, which was not taken very kindly at all, and then of course support for Russia in the Ukraine invasion. So that has been a massive change in a short time. Indeed, it has been so much so that it has created a lot of so-called whiplash effects here and there. Going back to the Norwegian case again, all the faff that was it 2 years ago or something, about Equinor reviewing their contracts with Chinese coastal for work on the Norwegian oil fields, kind of illustrates that, because Coastal bought this Norwegian company way back, I think it was in 2008, and nobody was at any point raising any issues about that other than, patting them on the back and saying, job well done. A couple of years later, and Coastal doing their same old things, presumably with the same old people from Stavanger they always have, is suddenly a political hot potato. So it's a lot for also the businesses to take in the changes that has happened under such a short time. I mentioned before Lithuania facing way more substantial economic pressure in 2021 than what Norway did in 2010. However, because of all this, the backing that they eventually received from the US, very importantly, and from the EU at an extremely different level than the backing Norway saw, which was not all that much at all. So, political change in intentions. However, Europe's capabilities are shortly summarized. Europe is now in a relatively weak position compared to China. It's common to say that the old European model was built on these three legs. Cheap energy from Russia, use that to make fancy stuff you sell to China, machinery and so forth, whilst the US cover the security bill. Of course, as you all know, all of these three legs are in various degrees of decay or have completely fallen off. Russia, China does not need as much exports again, to bring back the example of Chinese, Norwegian export to China. Now we do more salmon than machinery. And the US, of course, is what everyone's talking about all the time, so I won't repeat that. And ironically, also, after the EU in 2010 declared for the first time that now we're also looking at China as a systemic rival, which is a big step politically, but economically, Europe already was way more economically dependent on China than was the US, and it became increasingly much so even after this date. Systemic rival in 2010, but the value of European imports from China doubled from 2018 till 22, so exactly in this period. And particularly China is in a bit of a pinch. It's considered that roughly 10% of the GDP is directly tied to the Chinese market. And of course, Europe has gone from a peaceful neighborhood policy to what was at some point called the Ring of Fire around it, and now has large-scale war ongoing at the continent itself. However, there was a lot of talk now that Trump too was elected and took office, that meant that China had to actively court Europe in order to avoid Europe and the US increasingly ganging up together on China. So there was a lot of talk, which I never really wrapped my head around, about this big charm offensive China ostensibly did towards Europe. But I don't know. Let's see if this works. So this is, when it comes to Europe-China relations, a big thing just happened. It was recently the 50-year celebrations of EU-China bilateral relations. Celebrations meant to be in Brussels because they swap the summits around every other year. Xi Jinping couldn't be bothered. He prioritized going to Moscow, so instead flew them into Beijing. Meeting, and they cut the meeting short to 1 day. And this is the glorious ascent to the Beijing capital with no one there to greet them, which is it's a solid breach of diplomatic protocol, as you can just Costa's face when he realizes that there is no one there is quite it's quite something. So it's not quite the Xi Jinping welcome to London, and it is not at all a charm offensive, even though they did raise sanctions or remove the sanctions on some members of the European Parliament and took things down a little bit. Final slide. Given all of these Europe-China relations, currently very chilly, there is no much charm to be seen in any directions. Post-Trump, you saw von der Leyen, which is a key person in de-risking European economy from China, and is one of the leading China hawks, so to be said, in Europe, which is of course important given that the Commission is in charge of trade policy. Talk now, increasingly tough talk relations now at an inflection point. There's a new economic security regime being worked on, a lot of, particularly to counter economic pressure. You have the so-called anti-coercion instrument that is potentially powerful, has yet to be used. It will be very interesting to see if Europe will actually go to that step at some point. You have ongoing trade disputes, tariffs, and this just in, I read the newspaper the other day, they're working on, I'll have them for a while, more secondary sanctions on Chinese entities supporting Russian war effort. And what I just saw is that Trump, according to Financial Times, this asked Europe to put 100% tariff on Chinese goods, together with the US, in order to pressure them to not supporting China. That is a massive ask. I'll be surprised if that happens, but the extent of this latest sanctions package and how much they dare to turn the screws on Chinese support for Russia will shape what we see in China-Europe relations for quite a while. China, of course, has a long tradition of they call splitting the barbarians to control the barbarians. I mean, Rome used divide et impera, it's what successful empires do. You can play up transatlantic tensions, easier now than it was under Biden, and of course you can play the Commission against the various member countries. Just to give von der Leyen a bit of a revanche after that bus ride. I just put up that slide. That's the very recent IMF data who shows that now actually the European economy just about has overtaken China again. This is all excluding the UK, by the way. Of course, in a historical perspective, it is like the Euro crisis of 2008. I think it's massively undercommunicated just how important that was. Because, I mean, look at the curve of European and US economy following each other closely there, and then you get to the Euro crisis after the financial crisis, and it just completely changes trajectory. If it had followed the former trajectory, we would be in a very, very different place at this point, both with regards to China and to the US. Again, back to the bus picture, I was trying to imagine how Xi Jinping would have reacted. The Europeans didn't make too much of a big deal of it, actually. I was trying to imagine how Xi Jinping would have reacted. I did not manage to imagine that, because that is essentially unthinkable. And to kind of return back a bit, like, geopolitically speaking, it is kind of nuts. Like, why would you humiliate someone? It would be really nice if it was less in the US corner in this great power competition of the future. But again, it is symptomatic of China exercising their identity as a rejuvenated great power that, a bit like the McCartney expedition, does not need European stuff that much anymore. So again, it's a bit full circle. If that is also a bit of the same hubris from the McCartney expedition coming full circle, we will see. But in any case, the changes and importantly the continuities in Chinese identity and how that relates to Europe has roots that go 100-odd years back and is likely to continue to shape the relationship also in the years going ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjørnar, for that survey of a really thorough account on China-Europe relations. And again, the historical dimension here should not be underestimated. I highly recommend taking a peek at the many pages of the book, because this was really just a small smock beat. Now I would like to introduce Professor Astrid Nordin, who is the Lau Chair of Chinese International Relations at the Lau China Institute at King's College. She is also an Associate Research Fellow at their Swedish Institute of International Affairs, which is our sister institute in Stockholm. And Astrid's research develops critical conceptual tools that draw on Chinese and other global traditions of thought, and uses these to understand global challenges as they relate to China's growing global role, from the Belt Road Initiative through support for overseas Chinese communities to practices of censorship and resistance. Astrid, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been working with NUPI for a number of years now, but this is the first time I've actually managed to show up in person. So I'm really delighted to be here and look forward to our conversation together. And a big thank you not just for bringing me here, but for nudging me to read this wonderful book that we've just heard about. I must admit, I had low expectations. I hadn't thought about the fact there was Bjørnar writing this book. So this book turned up on my desk, and it was about China-EU relations, and I thought, well, it'll be a bunch of economic stats and it'll be a bit boring, but it's not that book. As you'll have seen, this is a really engaged, thoroughly historically grounded and intellectually contributing book, and I really enjoyed the reading, so I recommend it for your Christmas wish list. I thought it was a really wonderful book to read, and an important one. So how, the book asks, do China and Europe understand one another? What symbolic weight do they carry for each other? And how do these stories shape the world that we live in? And Bjørnar's book gives us a powerful guide to that. So at its heart, there's a simple insight, but one that I'm sure many of us European readers will relish, that Europe has never been just another actor or partner or adversary in China's foreign relations, that Europe has been constitutive of Chinese political identity and a Chinese sense of self. And the book traces this, as we've heard, across Chinese history, from back in the days when Europe was just this imagined Latin country somewhere in the far off distance on the other end of the world. And it shows how encounters with Europe, from the Opium Wars through the Republican era to contemporary PRC diplomacy, have provided mirrors and templates through which China has defined itself. Now, the organising theme throughout is the book's subtitle, The Barbarian Civilization. And that's a term that does real intellectual work in the book. And as Bjørnar has told us about some of the really thorough empirical work that he's done, I'm going to focus on this intellectual core of his contribution in my comments. So through this terminology, the book grapples with idealized civilization as well as demonized barbarism in the Chinese sense of self. And this, of course, is not just a Chinese distinction, but one that's also shared with Europe. So in Confucian thought, the civilized center was surrounded in the traditional cosmology by barbarian peripheries. And if we want to, we can discuss a little bit about that tradition later on. And in European international relations, of course, the standard of civilization was used to justify inclusion, exclusion, and of course, copious amounts of violence. Now, Bjørnar shows how these two traditions collided, intertwined, and co-produced one another. And Europe was never simply external to China. It was part of the very constitution of Chinese identity. And China, conversely, helped define Europe, what it meant when it spoke of civilization. Now, most importantly, I think the book refuses to categorize China or Europe as either civilized or barbarian, even though one has been emphasized over the other at different points in time. China and Europe are simultaneously civilized and barbarian, both and neither. And the two terms, of course, also shape one another. So the richness of the analysis in the book, I think, emerges from holding these two terms in creative tension without trying to resolve that into one term. Now, Bjørnar has told you about a number of important practical take-homes that he emphasizes from his book. And for me, the book helped me think through three key take-home points. Now, the first one is that this civilization barbarian couplet is by no means a thing of the past. It lives on in today's speeches and textbooks and diplomatic rituals. And just as William Callahan, a number of scholars that we both admire, have shown how the tension between these two terms remains central to Chinese foreign policy, this book demonstrates how Europe's enduring symbolic role is central to this narrative. Second, the Europe and the China that emerge from that tension are fruitfully thought about, not as billiard balls that crash into one another and bump off in different directions without essentially changing, but instead I think it calls on us to think of them as temporary, contradictory and forever changing effects of their relationship. Now, taking that take-home seriously, really seriously, will require academics and practitioners to do some pretty serious rethinking, pretty difficult rethinking. So we've got our work cut out for us, I think, at the back of this book. Now, third, the category Europe that is deployed in Chinese official stories about China itself is really varied and unstable. So sometimes it's elevated as a civilizational peer, sometimes it disappears into a larger threatening category of the West. And this tension between Europe as distinct and Europe as subsumed into broader categories, I think, is crucial for how both sides imagine themselves today. Now, it seems to me that Europe is similarly replete with stories in tension about what and who we are and what we want to be. Now, this multitude is perhaps one of our greatest virtues, but it's also something that can throw spanners in the proverbial works. And I think this raises a question for Europeans. Is being the past source of Western civilization the best we can do? If not, what else could we be in China's eyes as well as in our own? Now, at this moment, as we've heard, of course, Trump's America First amplifies the stakes of this question. His second presidency has unsettled allies as much as rivals. And for Europe, US reliability is in question. Now, for China, this unpredictability is dangerous, but also an opportunity to cast itself as the custodian of civilization, in contrast to American or Western chaos. Now, Xi's parade with Putin and Kim by his side is in contrast, again, really neatly to the European bus reception that we've just seen. And of course, that was Xi demonstrating loudly and amply to the world this closeness with both Putin and Kim as part of what was not only a military spectacle, it was also a performance of civilizational solidarity and an assertion that alternative centers of the world order exist beyond Washington, beyond the West, and indeed beyond Europe. So just as the burning of the Summer Palace was a performance of barbarism and civilization, these events today, summits, parades, busing-ins, are staged to signal identity and hierarchy. So we're living through another round of identity construction on a civilizational theme. It reminds us that international relations are about power, yes, but also about identities and the stories that we tell about who we are. Who is civilized, who is barbarian, and who gets to tell the stories that make the distinction between those two. Now I want to finish by saying something about these stakes and what challenge this raises for us, not just as Europe in the abstract, but as critical thinking and feeling Europeans and Scandinavians. So we Europeans and Scandinavians, we quite like to see ourselves as the vanguard of good values, and we like to think that we stand for equality and fairness and justice, and us Scandinavians, I think, are proud of punching about our relatively tiny weight in global governance. And if I may add, as a Swede, we can also be terribly self-righteous about all of that. But to many in China and in much of the global south, I'd like to add, we are simply part of a barbarian civilization. Civilization that colonized, looted, extracted, and still insists on those very values and ways of thinking that justify all of that violence. So from that perspective, ideas that are presented as alternatives to this Western model are bound to look increasingly attractive. So what do we do in the context of an uncomfortable legacy? How can we show both solidarity and humility in a context where the big guys on the block are increasingly explicit that to them might is right? Now, the best answer I've come up with so far is something like trying to practice more cognitive empathy. Taking really seriously this idea of mutual constitution and starting our thinking from the relationship and understanding these entities to emerge from there. Now that's hard and I'm not there quite yet, but this book has really helped me on along that path. Maybe I'll close by opening this question to Bjørnar and to any in the audience who also want to join that conversation. How can we be differently with the story that China and others tell about us? And what other stories could we become? I have some more specific questions for Bjørnar if there is time, but I've spoken quite a lot now, and I'm sure there are lots of comments and questions from the rest of colleagues in this room as well. So, shall I sit down and we'll take from there. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Astrid, for the comments and also for the questions. I think in the interest of time, we will gather a few questions also from the room and then also allow Bjørnar to respond and Astrid to respond to those while also taking up the questions that Astrid posed and has on her agenda. So I see two hands. We'll start here with you, Inga, move over to Henrik, and then this last here.
Thank you. You, Inge Bekkevold, Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, colleague of Bjørnar. So congratulations, Bjørnar, on the book. I have not read it, so maybe you answered my question in your book. But I have one sort of challenge or question to you. The Chinese identity, how much today in their foreign policy and in their relationship with Europe, how much is actually Chinese and how much is communist? And the reason I'm asking that question is actually because you used the example of Germany and Denmark. Why the Danes don't pay that much attention to their losses, while China does. And the answer to that question is very simple, it's communism. Because the current regime in Beijing is communist, and the whole communist movement in China builds on anti-imperialism. So if you had a different government in China over the last few decades of today, I think you would have a different narrative. So my question to you is sort of the identity and the narrative you build on in your book. How much is actually Chinese and how much is communist? And of course, the Chinese Communist Party has been there for 100 years, so it's very much part of China. But I think it's sometimes useful to distinguish between those. So that's my question.
Henrik Kim, I'm also a colleague of Bjørnar's. Thank you for an excellent introduction. I have a question regarding the point you sort of left off with. Why did China sort of humiliate European delegation during the summit this summer? And one possible interpretation of it is, well, there wasn't the original purpose that people talked about for the charm offensive was to split Europe and the United States apart. With Donald Trump, there is no need to split Europe and the United States apart. Donald Trump is already doing that for China. And secondly, there is a tendency in China to regard Europe as weak in terms of material power and divided. So again, no need for a charm offensive. I wonder what you would think of that, and how also, big question, like how should we approach it as Europeans?
Great, and last question here.
So it's, my name is Caroline, I'm from the Embassy of Japan, but I'm speaking for myself, not my employer. Please don't correlate my question to them. It's much along the same tune as the one before me, but would it then possibly be beneficial for Europe to play into this identity and important of face when it comes to meeting the Chinese in order to signal our power when we meet them? Not only in how we tend to pull out all the stops like we saw in the UK when they come to us, but also start demanding that they do the same for us when we come to them. So do we need to increase the European focus on this performative identity signaling with China in terms of taking this theory and these questions into actual actions in how we position ourselves with the Chinese?
I think that last question maybe also relates back to Astrid's question about how can we be differently, or what can our expectations be. So maybe we could start with the first three Yoingas concerning the role of communism and how much this influence, if it was a different type of government, would be a different narrative. And Henrik on the summit. But not least, how can we be different? What can we expect? Bjørnar, would you like to start?
I can start. Big and fun questions. I mean, first, thank you so much to Astrid, not only for the kind words, but also for doing a better job of presenting my book than I did myself. So that's a very good summary. And a lot of fun points we can discuss later. Should I first go through all the questions and then let Astrid, or should we ping-pong a bit?
You can do it as you please.
Yes, please.
I'll comment mostly on the last one, I think.
Yeah. So, Yoingi's question, I mean, how much is Chinese and how much is communism? It is, first of all, of course, it's very difficult to make a neat subdivision about which is which. So one of the points that I was making earlier is precisely that it would have been way easier 30, 40 years ago, but with this increasing confluence merging together, that the Chinese government has started on, increasingly defining China as a communist, traditional Chinese heir, is essentially blending these two things way more together. And when it comes to the historical memory, it's a very good point. I mean, anti-imperialism, of course, is key to the communist credo from the very beginning, but of course also key to the early republic movement in China, because all Chinese experienced, or Chinese elites experienced imperialism in one form or another, which tends to make you slightly not well disposed towards it. So what I think, which I didn't have time to go much into in the slides, is the memory politics of all this, and in particular the memory politics of seeking to merging increasingly the communists and the, let's say, traditional Chinese side of things, and how that has played in how China tells its history of itself. Because the 100 years of humiliation was not seen, or it was not treated in text, school books, etc., as so much of a big deal under Mao Zedong. When they really started leaning heavy into this was first under Deng Xiaoping, like after the Tiananmen massacre, when essentially there was a realization that China needs to lean more into nationalism and building up this grievance nationalism against the former powers. So I hope I did not make it come through that the hang-up on the 100 years of humiliation has been a constant throughout Chinese history. It has very much changed, and it has changed in line with how the relationship between the communist strand of thought and the traditional Chinese strand of thought has merged together. You can also see the same regarding the celebrations of the Second World War, which is of course a very hot topic these days with all the parades. The old Chinese Communist Party did not care too much. It was focused a lot on the Civil War. Now they're rewriting the history of that and actually from parades inviting Taiwanese troops to march in one of those parades. Yeah, thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to go a bit more in detail on that. Henrik, regarding, I mean, Trump is splittist by definition, but, and that is where I think the second Zeitenwende is perhaps as important as the Zeitenwende compared to Russia. The EU, independently of Donald Trump, has gone through a massive change in their outlook on China. Again, both in public and politicians. So, whether the EU follows through and the extent to which they do on all the plans for the risking from China, it's actually a decision that to a larger degree than before rests in Brussels instead of as a result of being dragged by the hair by the United States, as was the case maybe 5 years ago. Also, it will be really interesting to see what goes on, because of course, as mentioned before, the tricky thing with de-risking from China is incredibly difficult. It is even more difficult for Europe, which is way more dependent on China economically than is the United States. And it is even more difficult when you have Donald Trump banding around 15% tariffs in a kind of sort of deal that he kind of sort of doesn't care about, because now is threatening with more economic coercion if Europe goes ahead with telling digital companies what to do, etc. And also because a graph from earlier that I didn't have time to go into, the Europe managed to decrease their export dependency on China. So exports to the Chinese market went down. Everybody thought it was great. We are finally risking, hooray. Where did all of those goods go instead? They were exported to the United States and causing the trade deficit, the American trade deficit with Europe to balloon, and hence making Trump in an even more adverse mode towards the EU than he arguably already was. I've been talking a lot. Do you want to take Caroline's question? Oh, I should also I forgot you.
Easily done.
No. Yeah, it's a really good point, Caroline, and yeah, I mean, should Europe have demanded to be treated properly? I mean, arguably they should, but it's difficult to do when China pulls off such an obvious power play from the very start, from being like, nah, can't be bothered to go to Brussels, to, you know, like the entire thing down. They cancel a round trip with the Prime Minister, which was originally scheduled by Beijing, because partly, again, to get back to one of the central themes of the presentation, they felt disrespected by some of the comments that von der Leyen made on the G7 summit some time earlier. And then I'll leave the rest of that for Astrid. And just saying, how can Europe be something different? I think what Europe needs, just to borrow from Chinese history, is a good deal of self-strengthening. The Chinese were doing when they suddenly realized they could not match the European powers on the battlefield or indeed in economic productivity and so forth. You have all these reports coming out, Mario Draghi, about the manners in which Europe, independently of the trade relations with the US or China for that matter, are kicking their own legs from underneath themselves. I think so. There are some numbers as to how internal trade barriers within the EU, within the EEA, is the equivalent of a tariff of numbers on the slide somewhere, but tariff of like 40% on goods and 110% on services. That is a crucial fix that should be made in putting around house really proper in order. Because there's a lot of potential in doing that. And in retelling the European story, it's not just a past civilization responsible of colonialism. I think to direct the gaze towards something that hasn't been mentioned so far, I think in terms of redefining Europe in the world, I think the future of Europe's relationship with Africa, which was even more roughly treated by colonialism than China, but is now, it's straight across the fjord. A lot of interesting dynamics happening there, which one could talk about at length, particularly when it comes to Chinese influx in the continent. So how Europe, if they manage to successfully, I have to say, practice that cognitive empathy in successfully competing with China in Africa, that will be a key arena to look at for other concepts.
We have 3 more questions in the audience, so I'm going to be ambitious and do the word quickly, pop the questions, and then try to get to the answers. We'll see. Yeah.
I'll try not to waffle then, but address this question about should we be a bit ruder? That's your question to China. I think no is the answer. The context in which we are choosing how to act is one where we are already cast as kind of the historical assholes of national humiliation, right? Not just in communication by the Chinese government to its own domestic population, but to all of Africa and other parts of the world, where the Chinese Communist Party's narrative is, look, those are the humiliators out there. They will bully you and disrespect you, also kill you and enslave you, by the way, but they haven't learned their lesson, and they turn up here trying to teach us lesson, being snooty about it, and not take responsibility for their own inappropriate behaviors. And they come here and they into that and be the disrespectful ones, or we can try and say, you know what, we're not going to stoop to that level and play that game. If we demand things, we're going to demand things that are actually really important to us, rather than meeting with, I don't know what the equivalent of the Queen would be. She had excellent hats. I think it's hard to find an equivalent in the Communist Party. But I just think we have more important fish to fry than to virtue signal by being disrespectful to anybody in diplomatic relations. A bit more complicated, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Iver, Ralph, and here, and then I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop with questions, but please be brief and question.
Thank you, Ren. Mine is a comment, actually, on the question of ceremony in diplomacy. This is not totally uncommon. Israel put Turkish diplomats in low chairs some 15 years ago so that they could sit and talk down to them. And the result was a breach in diplomatic relations that lasted for years. When von der Leyen visited Turkey, or Erdogan's Turkey, I would say, there was no chair for her. So why is this so offending? Because it reads out the basic principle of world order as we know it, which is sovereignty. Reciprocity of sovereignty is the important thing here. And that means that a certain etiquette will be followed. Now, if you break that, you go back to the old imperial days where you grade the greetings as they come along. And that's what China is doing here. And then there are two possibilities. This may be done because they don't recognize the EU as a fully fledged state, which it isn't, so that's one reading. The other reading is that this is just standard imperial behavior.
Ralph?
Yeah, my name is Ralph Weber, University of Basel, Switzerland. Two quick questions. One is I still struggle understanding the claim of the book in terms of identity, because there are two different claims one can make. One is to say that identity drives politics, right? The other is to say that it plays a role. And I'm not quite sure which one of the two you're making, because you could turn it around and say policy is using ideology to reach its goals, right? And then for that we have a whole propaganda department and so on and so forth, throwing around those very terms that you base your claim on, right? Like the 210 and so on. And the second one, to drive that home a little bit, and that's to your Inge's comment about communism and Chinese, right? What sort of Chinese do we have there in the argument? Because there's a problem if we make Confucius, the way that the Communist Party uses him, to be Chinese, right? Because it's a very curated version of Confucianism that's being used, cut off in many ways. Hu Jintao misquoting the NLX and so on and so forth, right? And in your graph, I noticed just when you had this nice graph about Kungzi and going up, right? One noticed in the last 5 years, not going up anymore, but going down a little. And that, I think, shows some recent developments on Confucianism in the mainland that I think play into your story a little bit. That's the question. Thank you.
Yes, Audun Golstavik from DNB Bank. Thank you for a very insightful lecture, reminding us that international relations is about much more than economics. At the same time, I think I do believe that economics is well worth reflecting on. And to a point on your slide here, that the EU is preparing secondary sanctions against China. To what extent do you think that that will trigger retaliation through the anti-foreign sanctions law? And building on that, if there is a grand bargain with the US on the horizon, where is that going to lead Europe? And do you see that inform European strategic thinking on China relations?
Ending with some very big questions, which might need a new entire seminar, I think, coming up. But Bjørnar, I'll give you the floor for another minute to close.
Okay, so I will not be able to do these questions justice. Apologies in advance. As to, yeah, very good point from Iver there, and which goes into, as I briefly mentioned, China's imperial tradition increasingly playing into diplomatic relations. Also, point one, poor von der Leyen, I mean, and then just now her plane was GPS spoofed by the Russians, so she's a tough lady to crack. Wembley Derby, Queen of England kind of hat. But
Keep prefetching.
yeah, I looked up on the AI. Ralph, to your comment, it's a good observation, and that's also why the title of the book is the identity fact, which, I mean, it's not perfect with regards to certain theoretical debates, but it's to get the point through that it is not the sole driver of the relationship. It is a factor that has been overlooked and now is being addressed. So hence, of course, that, and because of that, the nature of the book is focusing on what has not been researched before, mentioning briefly the broader context, as I also try to do here, of economic trends and political trends, but also looking into the identity factor. And the way I think it is also a factor as a driving force is that it's not only being used to justify as justification for reaching some goals. It is part of defining what those goals are in the first place. And indeed, on that graph, Hu Jintao, he misquoted Conze, but he quoted him. Xi Jinping leaning less into that, and that goes into some more specifics on the ideologization drive that he is in the midst of now. That's I won't have time to get into, but it's very true. Then will secondary sanctions meet with a reaction? So there has already been secondary reactions on two tiny Chinese banks. They were, which led to some complications. So not formal sanctions according to the rules, but making it trickier to get hold of railroads to the vital, important European power industry, which now they claim they managed to smooth out. I think it depends on what the scope is, because we do not know anything more than they are working on it. Trump wants Europe to do some like banana stuff. Where it ends up on the scale from being on the banana scale, as it were, will very much define that. And yeah, if there is a deal with Donald Trump, and that goes into the whole transatlantic relationship, because what happened after his negotiations, China was, von der Leyen was making, actually inserted some nice sounding bits about China after Trump's election. China was at the beginning of the year making nice noises towards Europeans as well. But when in May Trump and China got to the kind of de-escalation agreement, then suddenly all of that kind of fell off, and then you get von der Leyen on a bus and all of that jazz. So extremely important for them.
Great. I know there were additional questions in the audience. Bjørnar will be here for a little bit after the seminar, so we hope you can have some bilateral discussions. But thank you again to all of you for coming to the seminar today. And a reminder to please check out our upcoming events. You can look at geopol.no, which is noted at the bottom of that poster, for information about our upcoming annual lecture, which will take place on the 15th of October, and other exciting publications and engagement. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the week.